One of the most common things people will complain about in the film industry is that there's no originality left in Hollywood. Though I wish I could argue otherwise, the same can often be said about video games. Too often these days we see one semi-original game come out and, in the half-decade to follow it, publishers release a slog of conformity hoping to recreate the greatness that was a single title. In the ensuing aftermath, older ideas are tossed by the wayside, discarded as if doing otherwise would be an insult to the player's intelligence. It's a shameful practice, but it's also a reality that we have to face daily. Such is the fate of the shoot-'em-up, the side-scrolling beat-'em-up, and the run-and-gun unrealistic shooter. However, every now and then we get a throwback to that golden age when design decisions came more out of necessity than choice. When AAA titles didn't have to conform themselves to as common an audience as possible, and when developers weren't being pushed by publishers to make the next great cash cow of a game. These titles are excellent time capsules that remind us of an age gone by, but the truly impressive ones are those that manage to bridge the gap between old and new, and do so well. Wolfenstein: The New Order from freshman developer Machine Games wants to be that rare blue moon of a title. With 5 years having passed since the last title in the series, and a AAA industry devoted to creating the next Call of Duty, Grand Theft Auto, or League of Legends killer, does The New Order have the strength to remind our game publishers that victory doesn't have to be found by copying in the present, but instead looking to the past?
Wenn sie sich so bewegt und diese Worte zu mir spricht, ganz leise in mein Ohr, mir sagt, dass sie mich liebt.
At the break of dawn on July 16, 1946, more than a year after our allies defeated the fascist Nazi army, the armed forces of the free world mount a desperate attack on the fortress of General Wilhelm Death's Head Strauss, one of the most powerful men in the Nazi army. Where once the Allied powers pressed the advantage, the Germans have turned the tide, and are driving their enemies back to the sea thanks to unprecedented advanced technologies of unknown origin. General Death's Head is believed to be the mastermind behind the Nazis' radical new weaponry, and at the spearhead of this last-ditch assault stands Captain William B.J. Blazkowicz, the Office of Secret Actions agent responsible for defeating him twice before. Though the Allies make a valiant effort, the mission is ultimately a failure. Blazkowicz finds himself blown out to sea, taking shrapnel to the head and leaving him in an almost vegetative state. Trapped in his own body, BJ watches with flickering consciousness as the world goes on around him from inside an insane asylum in Poland. What seems like minutes or days is, in reality, months and years, and before he even knows it, he finds himself finally waking up in 1960, 14 years after his final mission. The German Empire, once on the ropes, now rules the world, and people under their thumbs suffer for it. Free of his comedic prison, Blazkowicz resolves to find the resistance and get back to doing the one thing he's remarkably gifted at: killing Nazis. When Wolfenstein 3D arrived on the scene in 1992, it was meant to be a technology demonstrator with a focus on gunning down fascists, so it's natural for someone to not exactly expect a focus on story development. Though the series received 2 story-focused sequels, with one in 2001's Return to Castle Wolfenstein reboot, and Raven Software's 2009 singular title Wolfenstein, story has never been the series' strong point. After 22 years of ill-developed continuity, it's reasonable to suggest that any new Wolfenstein game would ignore the previous entries and instead try to establish its own. This new Wolfenstein is not such a game. Rather, at many instances, it scoffs at the notion of ignoring what has already been established. The New Order, instead, readily acknowledges the events of Return to Castle Wolfenstein and its 2009 sequel. Old friends and antagonists return, once-fought enemies receive a fresh coat of paint and a new set of armor, while BJ and crew actively mention key moments from both titles. I find it remarkable that a freshman developer would go to the lengths to actively both establish continuity with an already obscurely connected storyline, while at the same time progressing it to a place that allows for a considerable amount of freedom. So I've got to take my hat off to the folks at Machine Games, a studio founded only in 2009 by key employees of Starbreeze Studios, specifically the teams responsible for The Darkness and The Chronicles of Riddick. These guys know how to make a story, but more importantly, they know how to tell one. The best part of the story, as it turns out, is narration. BJ Blazkowicz, or any id Software originating character for that matter, have never really been known for their storytelling prowess, but Machine Games has channeled their pedigree and brought us narration in the same manner that we got in The Chronicles of Riddick and The Darkness. The results are simply wonderful, as BJ Blazkowicz is presented as a remarkably introspective character. As he continues on his vengeful stride against General Deathshead, his comments on the terrible crimes of the Nazi war machine, while reflecting upon his own personal losses and hatred for the man, are terrifically done thanks to a spectacular performance by a grumbly-voiced Brian Bloom. Everything from one-liner about cursing the moon for allowing Nazis to dare land on it, to a rather emotional recitation of Emma Lazarus' The New Colossus, are wonderfully done. Though one wouldn't expect it, the game's dialogue easily stands shoulder to shoulder with many great recent titles such as The Last of Us, BioShock Infinite, and heck, even Half-Life 2. Yeah, despite featuring a few plot holes here and there, as well as forcing the player to discover most of the events that occurred during BJ's 14-year-long absence, Wolfenstein: The New Order is a very well done story, and it's worth experiencing.
The war ain't over. Look at all these Nazis walking around. They won.
Wolfenstein: The New Order may have been made in the current age of cover-based shooters, but it also looks back at the formulas of yesteryear with a fond eye. Rather than ditch one formula for another, this title tries to meld two different formulas to a surprising amount of success. At its heart, much of The New Order is built around a soft cover-based combat system similar to that used in Killzone, in which pressing up against cover and simply pulling the left trigger allows you to aim down sight over the edge of the cover. Alternatively, the game's mechanics allow for classic run-and-gun style combat. Players have the ability to sprint, slide, and blow away enemies with dual-wielded weapons such as assault rifles or even automatic shotguns because to hell with logic, it's fun! Most encounters you find will facilitate using both playstyles, but one would imagine that today's laser-accurate enemies would quickly turn you into a pile of human mush. But this is in fact not so, thanks to the game's abundance of support elements. Once again taking notes from two different eras, The New Order features a rarely used, segmented regenerating health system to keep BJ in the fight. Health regenerates in bunches of 20, and can be healed further by finding health pickups such as medkits and food that are littered throughout the world. The interesting part of the health system players should take note of is that it automatically regenerates health to the next increment of 20. So, for example, if you happen to pick up 5 health when you're at 60, it automatically takes that and pushes you up to 80. Quite easily, one can regain most or even all of their health bar by simply waiting for the regen segments to complete before picking up another health item. In addition, players can overcharge their health in a similar manner to that of old school competitive shooters such as Quake, allowing you to boost it as much as you want through health items at the cost of it slowly degenerating until it returns to your max health limit. One interesting element that Machine Games decided to incorporate is the Area Commander, a Nazi officer in charge of certain sections of maps. These officers will radio for help upon seeing you, spawning waves of reinforcements and making a previously normal combat scenario significantly harder. It's here that we are introduced to an element that has never really been a significant part of any Wolfenstein game: stealth. As with these Area Commander sections, most of the levels in The New Order feature at least several points in the map in which the player is strongly encouraged to engage in stealth combat. Stalking enemies through hallways, or even atop the occasional rooftop, feels quite satisfying, once again channeling Machine Games' strong past when they worked at Starbreeze. Heck, this might be the closest thing stealth fans may get to Dishonored 2 when and or if it sees the light of day years from now. It's a rather simplistic system to be sure, but it works quite well, and doesn't completely discourage the player from wanting to slaughter them all with hails of bullets instead of a knife to the back. Replay value is quite strong for Wolfenstein: The New Order thanks to a series of collectibles as well as an interesting branching system. Throughout each map you can find multiple different collectibles such as Enigma codes, letters written by the inhabitants of the world, weapon upgrades, and, of course, gold and jewels. The true replay value for The New Order doesn't come from these elements, however. Rather, it's the aforementioned branching system known as timelines. In the first mission of the game, players are forced to make a decision that results in the death of one of two characters. In turn, that shifts the game's direction into a timeline. Though the vast majority of the game remains the same between the two timelines, small yet quite noticeable differences appear throughout the experience. You learn a different exploration skill set, certain areas of a map are in or accessible, cinematics are presented in a slightly different manner, side characters are replaced, and levels even sometimes branch into different directions, though always towards the same inevitable outcome. It's a really interesting way to approach replayability beyond simply adding a new mode or difficulty level to the mix, and the results are appreciated. Wolfenstein's gameplay as a whole is a rather great experience, with the only really prominent flaw being Machine Games' world building. Outside of the central plotline, most of the backstory about the characters in the world, as well as how the Nazis took over the planet during BJ's 14-year slumber, is something the player has to actively search the environment for. Even then, lots of questions remain unanswered. What happened to the United States? Why is Hitler only mentioned once throughout the entire game? What impact do your actions really have on the world, and how are other resistance cells faring? These and many other questions remain unanswered by the end of the game, though we can probably expect many of them to be things that the inevitable sequel should focus on. Let's get this right out of the way. Wolfenstein: The New Order is simply gorgeous. Running on id Software's proprietary idTech 5 engine, the same one that powered Rage in 2010, the results are spectacular. Unlike Rage, however, this version of the engine features almost no texture pop-in, which is something that I was previously worried about. Character models look fantastic with only a handful of flat, uninflated textures to be found throughout the environment, but that's understandable. Terrain destruction is well done and will quickly force corner campers to reposition themselves thanks to the variety of destructible cover available. The cinematics themselves are quite nice thanks to smart framing, great model animations, and strong pacing, as they don't beat around the bush in informing the player of what they want to and need to know in order to further the plot. In terms of audio, Machine Games has an equal amount of high and low points. As previously stated, Brian Bloom's narration of BJ Blazkowicz's internal monologue is fantastically done, as well as that of several of the game's antagonists. On the flip side, however, the actual musical score of the game is strangely downplayed, with the exception of a handful of cinematics. Though the game featured some rather great marketing in the form of German versions of 1960s Americana songs, as well as some original pieces, the soundtrack itself feels almost muffled by comparison and contains no real core theme for anybody except Death's Head himself. I find it weird that Mick Gordon, the creator of the stellar soundtrack to last November's Killer Instinct, was unable or not allowed to craft a core theme for BJ, let alone one that reflects his inner anger and sorrow at the events that take place around him. It's pretty unclear as just what happened here, but the results are a tad disappointing. Wolfenstein: The New Order is a game I would have never expected to play 3 years ago. An interesting, story-based Wolfenstein game with great character development that felt just as great as its 1992 incarnation? I would have declared that an improbable suggestion, and yet, here we are. The New Order doesn't break any ground that hasn't been tread before, but instead mixes a lot of great ideas, both old and new, to form a well-told story. It has its flaws, to be sure, and faces some stiff competition in the coming months, but it certainly seems to be the most delightful surprise of 2014. The lesson here is that you don't have to teach an old dog new tricks. Instead, you should let it teach you some old ones.